This morning was phenomenal to look back and see this whole theater full. When we were preparing this, we thought, I hope they all fit. And it was so cool to kind of see you all fit. And I loved that session. And I thought our keynote this morning got us off to a great start. And we're looking forward to the one that we'll have right now. Before I start my introductions of Susan, who doesn't really need introductions, but I just want to mention that the CSCL program chair, Krina Damza, came up to me and wanted me to announce that there's a CSCL social event. It's in the program, and she's going to start a meetup in Huva to make sure you guys can find the information. But in case you just want to remember, it's at the Sir Winston Churchill Pub, Wednesday evening, 6:30 p.m. That's on Crescent Street, 3 blocks from here. So you can find it, and they've got a reserved space down on the I think probably the basement of there, and it should be a great event if people want to go to that. All are welcome. You don't even have to have your CSCL card. What? You don't have a CSCL card? Okay. Susan Goldman is a very challenging person to introduce in some ways, but also fairly easy to introduce in some other ways because she's done so much and she's been so engaged with so many people for so many years, and in this community in particular. And most recently, she has been and I think will be for a month or two, a distinguished professor of liberal arts and sciences, psychology and education at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she was founding co-director of the Learning Sciences Research Institute. And most recently also, she's been the executive officer of this community. But I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So it's my honor today to introduce Susan as our second keynote of the ISLS Annual Meeting 2023. I don't want to take a lot of her time, but I want to talk about her role from my perspective as she's intersected with my experience of her as a mentor, a scholar, and a leader. So just to start with the mentoring, and you don't get many in your career. You're going to need them, and I got that one. So haha. I've had some other good ones too, and some of you know who you are. Okay, career advisor. Again, just the ability for Susan to speak truth and to speak it in a way that got right through around my career decisions, having her be able to write job letters for me. And when I took a new administrative job a few years ago, to actually, that she and her husband, Jim Pellegrino, came and had lunch with me and talked to me about, what it meant to do administrative work and higher education, drawing me into the ISLS, right, years and years ago, getting me involved and sort of talking me in through the tech angle, and then essentially revealing the layers of ISLS as she wanted to give them to me through my participation in that society. Basically showing myself, and I think showing a lot of other people, sort of how to do it. So modeling and feedback, probably some strengths of Susan as a mentor. And I just want to say thanks personally for everything that you've done there. As a scholar, Susan has such a long arc of work in psychology and education, including studies at the intersection of math, learning, and language, developing web-based tools for measuring digital literacy skills, such as the use of multiple information sources in the context of inquiry, cognitive psychometric and instructional validity of embedded assessments in standard-based math curriculum. A recent project engaged the Institute for Education Sciences and the U.S. Department of Education called Reading for Understanding across grades 6 through 12, evidence-based argumentation for disciplinary learning. As principal investigator of that grant, she coordinated research and development amongst 5 institutions and several school districts concerning the processes, instructional practices, and materials needed to support evidence-based argumentation from multiple sources in literature, history, and the sciences across grades 6 to 12. Is that big enough span, discipline, age group? In other work, Susan focused on the language demands of 9th grade algebra. She's also examined the cognitive, psychometric, and instructional validity of embedded assessments in standard-based math. Her work has bridged research and practice, has helped us to better understand how teachers learn to engage in forms of instruction that enable students to achieve the deep disciplinary learning that responds to the demands of the 21st century. She explores partnerships with practitioners to identify infrastructure, supports to sustain teachers and students in this learning, She's developed and researched several technology-based environments for learning and assessment, including the math problem-solving series, Adventures of Jasper Woodbury, and the Little Planet Literacy series. She's collaborated widely, including with two of my heroes, John Bransford and Jan Hopkins, and so many others. And there's no way to capture this kind of CV except to say she's had a major impact on several research domains. She's advanced the multidisciplinary landscape of the learning sciences, period. Finally, as a leader, I want to just say, in addition to her work as a professor and researcher, she's a founding co-director of the Learning Sciences Research Institute at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's served as president of the Society for Text and Discourse and vice president, Division C of the American Educational Research Association. She's an inaugural fellow of ISLS. She's been active in the ISLS since its founding. Susan just celebrated a milestone. I was my privilege to attend a retirement celebration in Chicago at AERA from her faculty position there. She's also retiring from what I understand is her 7th year of a 3-year term here as ISLS executive officer. And I know she was celebrated at a recent board retreat and dinner, but I really thought she deserves to see the full thunder of applause that only a 600-person amphitheater can properly deliver. You said don't embarrass you. That's not embarrassing. I just want to read a couple of lines from her description of her keynote talk to come. Susan says, I reflect on the evolution of my own research in terms of my own learning, about learning, and its intersection with the zeitgeist of the learning sciences. I offer some speculations about key issues and the challenges for future research on learning and education that arise from increasingly technologized societies that embody ever-present tensions between progressive and conservative sociopolitical movements. So she's taking it easy today. Just a bunch of softballs there. And I just want to say thank you very much for agreeing to do this. We need to hear your words. I want to give a warm welcome to Susan Goldman and thank her for delivering the keynote this evening.
Well, so I don't think I should give this talk now. It's going to be anticlimactic, right? Let's see, how do I make this work? I'm still a Mac person, and I do not like PCs.
First, you want to touch the screen, probably. Now it's going to be arrows.
Okay. I can do arrows now. Okay. All right. So the invitation to do, first of all, thank you so much for the very generous introduction, Jim. This community is so near and dear to my heart. It actually is my heart. And it was really an honor to have this opportunity, although I did approach it with some trepidation. The invitation to do a keynote at the meeting was motivated in part by ongoing discussions about the affordances and constraints of face-to-face, virtual, and hybrid meetings, and about ISLS practices regarding the two-conference format for the annual meetings, why we made the change to one annual meeting, and so on. It became clear that a keynote about the origins of the learning sciences and computer-supported collaborative learning would be quite helpful to imagining possible futures. As I said, I was reluctant to take on such a keynote. However, Chris Gutierrez's keynote from last year echoed in my brain. She argued for methods of inquiry organized around, quote, imagining what is not yet. That is the proleptic property of learning that brings the end into the beginning. What Michael Cole has termed the cultural mechanism that brings the past into the present. So what I'm going to do today is bring my personal past into the present because my own research on learning over the past 50 years, yeah, it's been that long, is very much intertwined with key developments in the learning sciences and the CSCO community. This talk will, I hope, open up many conversations that imagine the future. Of course, I didn't start out in the learning sciences because such a thing didn't really exist when I started out back then. At that time, the psychology of learning was emerging from the dominance of behaviorism into an enlightened, quote unquote, world of information processing in the 60s when I was in high school, and the rise of cognitive psychology in the 70s when I was in graduate school. At the same time, behaviorist approaches to language were giving way to psycholinguistics as efforts to test the psychological implications of Chomskyan linguistic theory replaced Skinnerian and Hullian stimulus response accounts of language development. If you've ever heard of Hull, Chomsky, and Skinner, please raise your hand. Okay. All right, so not such terribly deep history. Anyway, what I have to say today is as much autobiographical as it is a reflection on where learning sciences came from and my personal take on where it is and where it might be headed. Let me also apologize in advance if I get some things wrong or leave out key events or people. So back to my beginnings as a researcher of learning. In the beginning, the 1970s. You might say I stumbled into the field of research on learning. In 1972, I decided after 2 years of being a stay-at-home mom of twin boys that it was time to resume my education. I applied to a clinical psychology program at the University of Pittsburgh. I was place-bound in Pittsburgh at the time. I wanted to research the relationship between school experiences and achievement and the development of a sense of self-competency. However, my research interests did not match any of those of the clinical faculty, and boom, I got my first rejection. So I looked for a part-time job and connected with Alan Leskold at the Learning Research and Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh. He was a new assistant professor and needed a research assistant. That was my introduction to human memory and learning research. I got introduced to theories and research on human learning that I had no idea even existed. I had done my undergraduate work at Barnard at Columbia University, where the only thing that we did was Skinnerian psychology. These were the days of box models of learning and memory and the relationship between how something was taken in or encoded, stored in memory, and later retrieved in response to some prompt. For example, tell me everything you remember from the meaningless list of words or word pairs that I just showed you earlier, where earlier was a few minutes ago, or it could be several days. There was lots of research at the time trying to figure out what made it easier versus harder to recall or recognize what had been studied. I found the work somewhat intriguing, although now I have no idea why. And I seem to be reasonably good at it, which I think was more important than I finding it intriguing. Anyway, I applied to graduate school at Pitt, this time in cognitive psychology, and was admitted in the fall of 1973 with Charles Perfetti as my advisor. The research I did during those formative PhD earning years was very much about individual learning, particularly language processing and reading, informed by psycholinguistic theories. I wanted to know what was happening in an individual's head that they remembered some things that had been presented, but not others, that some cues helped some people, but seemed to have no effect at all on other people. Indeed, variation among individuals was probably one of the most important drivers of the cognitive revolution because it highlighted the active role of the individual in processing, interpreting, remembering, and responding to objects, people, and events with which they interacted. Furthermore, the information an individual brought to the new situation, their prior knowledge, was crucial to processing and learning. What and how learners attended, the meaning they constructed and stored, the way they retrieved past experience depended in large measure on the knowledge they brought to new situations. What prior knowledge people brought to bear, how it was stored and activated, became a major question of interest to me, and I began exploring how context, and therefore the knowledge that got activated, impacted meaning construction. My master's thesis looked at whether situational context set up in a short paragraph impacted the interpretation of a particular linguistic construction. My earliest publications with my advisor looked at how the situational context developed in a text affected the effectiveness of a recall prompt. My dissertation explored how school-age children used their prior knowledge when they generated stories about everyday situations, specifically wanting something, having to do chores, and friendship relationships. This work as a graduate student stayed with me in terms of shaping and stoking my interest in understanding the learner as part of a larger experiential and cultural system. Although at the time, I know I would not have used those terms to describe my interests. My work was going on in the larger context of inquiries into structural and semantic properties of memory, episodic and semantic memory, story grammars, Schenck and Abelson's books, Scripts, Plans, Goals, and Understanding, an inquiry into human knowledge structures, Collins and Quillian's spreading activation theory. This was the era of mainframe computers, computer-assisted instruction, systems such as those developed by Suppies and Atkinson at Stanford, and the Plato system at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And at Carnegie Mellon University, Newell and Simon had developed a theory of human problem solving expressed in the form of a simulation program. Perhaps more important than the work I did as a graduate student was the environment at LRDC. The Learning Research and Development Center. I'm just realizing that you can't see the title of these slides. And they're very important. I put a lot of thought into what went on the top of each slide. Perhaps more important than the work I did as a graduate student was the environment at LRDC. The Learning Research and Development Center was one of a few centers funded in the 70s by the Department of Education to connect research on learning to schooling. The directors at the time, Robert Glazer and Lauren Resnick, created a context in which researchers were challenged to think about how academic laboratory research on learning, memory, and problem solving mattered and made a difference for teachers and kids in schools. There were faculty from psychology, sociology, and Pitt's School of Education, including curriculum developers as well as measurement types. And unlike typical academic tenure track positions, faculty were expected to collaborate. This emphasis coexisted in tension with the publish or perish mantra of R1 universities. It was a vibrant intellectual community. I watched as curriculum developers, reading specialists, and teacher educators queried cognitive psychologists about how their findings connected to the practicalities of teaching reading, and how that then pushed the cognitive psychologists to broaden and rethink their laboratory-based experiments, at least a little. I was a legitimate peripheral participant in many of these research meetings and seminars. And with Carnegie Mellon just across the street, I was exposed to the work of developmental psychologists on early math learning and cognitive development, computer simulations, etc. I don't think anyone would have called LRDC or CMU truly collaborative environments, but I learned the value of engaging in critical discourse about tough problems across different discourse communities that brought their own values and priorities to bear on issues fundamental to human learning. The value of these types of interactions, of listening to multiple perspectives juxtaposed with your own, was impressed upon me early in my academic career. I carried that commitment with me throughout my ensuing academic journey, and it sometimes got me in trouble, but that is perhaps best discussed during the social hour. As I moved into my initial academic positions, a year at Emory, followed by 10 at UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara, I continued to pursue knowledge use in story and reading comprehension. The stories were about everyday problem-solving situations, getting a dog, buying a bike, and relied on prior knowledge of such situations. The story comprehension work broadened to encompass strategies that readers used to navigate informational text from which the hope was they would actually acquire new content knowledge. I looked at how readers explored text in efforts to answer questions that involved integrating information across different parts of multi-page text, like a chapter in a textbook. We discovered that readers interacted with text in a variety of ways. What seemed to be associated with more complete and well-constructed responses was flexible use of a range of strategies, depending on the type of question, the reader's prior knowledge, and the complexity of the text, both in terms of content and structure. Methodologically, the importance of knowing what a reader was looking at and why led me to pursue verbal think aloud protocols during reading comprehension tasks. Santa Barbara was also a context that afforded opportunities to work with elementary school students for whom English was not their native language. Collaborating with two Latinx graduate students, we looked at how knowledge of story content and form acquired through Spanish was accessed equally, whether students were hearing or reading stories in Spanish or English. You simply had to allow them to pick the language that they wanted to respond in. This was important work because it bolstered arguments for dual language rather than English immersion programs in schools. And as part of this work, I have to say there was a very powerful emotional experience for me. I went to Mexico 2 summers in a row, and the first summer I was there, I was like in shell shock for 2 weeks. You guys who know me, I didn't speak for 2 weeks. I couldn't understand what was happening around me. I got on the bus and I showed them the street I wanted to get off, and they responded, and I said, okay. And then I rode 5 miles out of my way because I didn't understand where I was supposed to get off. And I was an adult who had some accomplishments under my belt, but I felt so totally incompetent and so much like a failure. That experience was so important to me because it help me understand what it feels like to be in a context that makes absolutely no sense to you, and how important the linguistic properties of that, the language and cultural properties of those new environments are, and how much it takes out of you to learn them. So in other collaborative work at Santa Barbara, I came face to face with the realities of introducing computer technology into K-12 schools. Working with a group of special educators, we undertook a survey study of the Apple giveaway program of the early 80s. Apple sent a computer to every school in California that requested one. Our survey sought to understand how they were being used. Long story short, lots of learning games, essentially drill and practice, but also lots of machines still in their original packing 2 years after delivery. But more importantly, we at Santa Barbara began to, along with others across the country, began to ask what roles these Apple II computers might play in classrooms. In particular, we hit on 2 kinds of functions: adaptive drill and practice for automaticity, and as tools for writing and revising. But in doing that work, what we learned very quickly was the computer by itself was obviously no panacea. This was a powerful learning experience in that it showed me how important the design of the task and the interaction context was for effective learning environments. It sparked an enduring intellectual interest in how computer technology might support student learning and teaching practices, an interest that has, as Jim indicated, stayed with me from then on, and which connected me with other like-minded scholars who constituted an emerging network of researchers who would be constituents of an emerging learning sciences community. Indeed, the 80s marked the emergence of the learning sciences. My comments here were informed by 2 really interesting chapters: Roy P.'s called The Prehistory of Learning Sciences, and Chris Hoadley's Short History of the Learning Sciences. Each of these chapters acknowledges the US North America-centric personal knowledge they draw on in these chapters. I want to reiterate their apologies, which they make in the chapters, and add my own to the international community of learning scientists. There was important work going on in Australia, the UK, and other parts of the world that contributed to the emergence of the learning sciences. I hope, and this is an open invitation, that you will get in touch so we can fill out these important international precursors of learning sciences generally, as well as the more specific work on computer-supported collaborative learning and computer-supported collaborative work. I don't have time to go into the details in these chapters, but suffice to say that during the 80s, there were a variety of institutions that had programs or were creating programs that sought to look at roles for educational technologies in teaching and learning. These groups included private companies, nonprofits, and universities, including the Education Department at both Baranek and Newman, the EMST program at UC Berkeley, Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Seymour Papert's group at MIT, Bank Street College's Center for Children and Technology, the Institute for Research on Learning, and the Learning Technology Center at Vanderbilt. These groups went beyond traditional instructional technology programs in that they were attempting to bring cognitive science research together with technologies in support of new models of learning that would move away from rote learning and would promote active inquiry on the part of learners. There were numerous convenings of representatives of these groups to discuss directions for research, needed funding initiatives, and the types of infrastructures that would be needed to leverage interdisciplinary empirical methods of cognitive science, and the quote to Chris Hoadley, the messiness of learning in context, as Chris put it. A key funding initiative for such work during this period was the Research and Science Education RISE program, which was at that time a joint venture of the US National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Education. These projects were largely targeted in math and science education. But a key funder emerged in the late 80s when the James S. McDonald Foundation, under the leadership of John Brewer, initiated the Cognitive Studies in Education Practice, or CSEP, program that lasted for a dozen years, 1987 to approximately 1999. CSEP funded approximately 100 projects, I counted them, that sought to enhance education practice and contribute to cognitive theories of learning. In my view, the annual meetings of these projects were foundational to nurturing the learning sciences in its infancy. Attendees included folks at Northwestern, UC Berkeley, University of Washington, University of Wisconsin, Carnegie Mellon, and many, many other places. People such as Brian Reiser, Rich Lair, Leona Schaubel, Pam Grossman, David Clark, Sam Weinberg, Jim Minstrel, Buzz Hunt, Marshall Lynn, Ann Brown and Joe Campione, Marlene Scardamelli and Cole Bereiter, Walter Kidge, Ken Katinger, Mitch Nathan, and others. These are names that should be pretty familiar to most folks in the learning science. Many of these folks figured prominently on the programs of the ISLS and CSCL programs from the 90s on. Through its annual grantee meetings, the CSEP program created a community of researchers attempting to do use-inspired research, a term from Stokes' 1997 book. Research at the intersection of cognition, education, and technology intended to impact issues in the here and now, as well as contribute to the development of theory, empirical research, and methodologies for understanding learning. The CSEP program was an important incubator for the learning sciences. It was certainly critical to my evolution as a learning scientist. In the late 80s, as I became more interested in roles for technologies, I became aware of the work on anchored instruction spearheaded by John Bransford, Ted Hasselbring, Chuck Kinzer, and Bob Sherwood at Vanderbilt University's Learning Technology Center. Those interests eventually led to me and Jim Pellegrino being hired at Vandy, initiating an exciting 12-year collaborative research endeavor. Excuse me. I was part of a team of cognitive researchers, math, science, and language arts educators, special educators, and practitioners on a development and implementation project called The Adventures of Jasper Woodbury that used video disc technology to bring mathematical problem solving into middle school classrooms. The development of the Jasper Adventures, and there were 12 of them in all, was funded by the National Science Foundation. Research on implementation and use of Jasper was funded by the CSEP program. Along with the Vandy team, I ventured further into the messiness of learning in context when we partnered with two other CSEP projects, Scardamalia and Berreiter's CECIL project, Computer Supported Intentional Learning Environment, later Knowledge Forum, and Brown and Campion's Fostering Communities of Learners project. This was at the behest of the McDonald Foundation to partner with the St. Louis Science Center as it launched a science magnet school in St. Louis. The Schools for Thought project, as it was dubbed, expanded on the design-based research each of the projects have been doing independently. In the case of each project, important researcher learning was happening in the context of the implementations regarding the critical insights and wisdom of the practitioners attempting to use the largely researcher-created designs. Teachers informed us about the kinds of tools and scaffolds they thought students needed. Observations of our teachers' use of the programs in their classrooms revealed so much of what we as researchers overlooked about engaging students in the intellectual work of mathematics, of reading, writing, and problem solving. At the same time, the energy and enthusiasm and the confidence exhibited by many of the students indicated the impact of moving instruction away from knowledge telling and toward the active participation of students and teachers in collaborative inquiry and sense making. Simultaneously with the Jasper and SFT work, I continued to pursue a line of research on text comprehension that expanded to work on multiple text comprehension, stimulated in part by conversations with Schools for Thought teachers and issues we encountered in the Schools for Thought work around comprehension of science, literature, and social studies texts. Working with a sociolinguist and former English teacher, David Bloom, we undertook a study of how students read and thought about why and what and how they were reading in English class versus science versus social studies. The whole day, whole year project, as we labeled it, took a Bakhtinian perspective and explored reading as a social intertextual process. We were exploring multivocality, multiple texts, power relationships in classrooms, and how classroom discourse positions students as agentive in their learning or not. I was now thinking about text speaking across time, both within a class period, across class periods, across the day and year. For me, reading was no longer happening in the head of the individual learner, but was a co-constructed relational process. As I mentioned earlier, many of the CSEP participants appeared on ICLS and CSCL programs in the 90s, a decade that firmly established the learning sciences and computer-supported collaborative learning as communities with clearly identifiable commitments and practices. In 1991, the first issue of the Journal of the Learning Sciences was published. In the foreword, Janet Kolodner wrote that the goal was to foster new ways of thinking about learning and teaching that will allow cognitive science disciplines to have an impact on the practice of education. With respect to CSCL, the term computer-supported collaborative learning was first publicly coined at an international workshop in Maratea, Italy in 1989. Thank you to Jerry Stahl and Frederick Hesse for this important information. A second workshop 2 years later was hosted by Tim Koshman in Carbondale, Illinois, with the support of the ACM, Association for Computing Machinery. In contrast to ICLS with its cognitive science orientation, the CSCL community identified with sociocultural orientations to learning, rooted more in cultural historical activity theory and Vygotsky's developmental theory. During the 90s, CSCL and ICLS held their first conferences. For CSCL, this was 1995 in Bloomington, Indiana. Keynoters were Victor Kaptelainen, who spoke on cultural historical activity theory, and Marlene Scardamelia, who spoke on knowledge building communities and acted in CSL/Knowledge Forum. Looking across CSCL conferences from 1997 to 2001, themes of plenaries and keynotes reflect exploration of uses of technology in collaborative instruction and learning. The first bona fide ICLS conference was in Los Angeles in 1994, but 1996 in Evanston is the first one for which I could find any information. The theme of that meeting was learning for the real world, and the call invited submissions that dealt with design, cognition, and/or social context, where social context was expanded to mean the social organization, cultural dynamics in formal and informal settings. From 1998 to 2002, ICLS themes emphasized designing for real-world problem solving, the complexities of doing so, and the importance of multidisciplinarity in studying such complexity. That takes us into the 21st century for ICLS and CSCL. And I labeled this slide Growing Pains, but Growing Up, and you'll probably all know why. Attendance at CSCL and ICLS conferences throughout the 90s suggested that there was indeed a critical mass to form an international society. But the society got off to a rocky start, in part because of the contrast between the largely North American attendance at ICLS and the more international makeup of the CSCL community and conference attendance. Fortunately, there was a resolution of the dispute that allowed the ISLS to move forward as a society within which there was a CSCL community that had its separate budget and that would continue to organize conferences. I don't know what that means, but we'll go on. In 2006, the International Journal of Computer-Supported Collaborative Learning published its first issue. In the foreword to that, Jerry Stahl and Frederick Hesse wrote, IJCSCL was proposed by the CSCL community and is sponsored by the International Society of the Learning Sciences. It heralds a transition of the field to a new level of academic maturity. You'll be happy to know that today, both IJCSCL and JLS now have very strong impact factors of approximately 6. The ICLS and CSCL conferences continued to alternate meeting years, but both sought to rotate to different parts of the globe on a regular basis. My read of conference and annual meeting themes from 2001 to 2023 is that they reflect a broadening of the issues of concern and a renewed appreciation for the complexity of learning in a global world. This complexity requires multiple disciplines working collaboratively, learning together, and augmented by tools that allow for sharing representations of multiple types and supporting discourse in iterative, reflective cycles of design and implementation. The complexity presents challenges for supporting as well as assessing learning processes and outcomes, not just cognitive, but social, emotional identity and affirmational processes and outcomes. Before I offer some speculations on the future of the learning sciences and CSCL community, I want to return to my own journey, which very much intersects with the directions I see in learning sciences. As I moved from Vandy to UIC in 2001, I felt that my transformation from cognitivist to learning scientist was complete. I was committed to a program of use-oriented research that explored ways in which technologies could support teachers and students in accomplishing the complex teaching and learning processes and outcomes, and of doing research situated in formal and informal learning settings. I had learned valuable lessons about the importance of working across the multiple embedded levels and systems in which the work of teaching and learning are embedded in the real world, complete with all the complexities that come along with working in those contexts. In moving to UIC, Jim Pellegrino and I saw the possibilities for building collaborations across multiple disciplines, and we secured the administrative support to do that, critical. In Chicago, I relearned with new twists, lessons similar to those from Nashville, around the complexities of working in real schools, in real cities, in real states, and that undergo their own cycles of change. Especially over the last 10 years, my own work increasingly reflects deeper collaborations and co-design work with practitioners, as well as with students, and deeper appreciation for the impact of systemic isms on human development. Thus, I have grown as a learning scientist to appreciate the complexity of human development and learning, the interconnections and interactions between our cognitive, socio-emotional, and cultural systems that are evident at multiple levels: neurological, behavioral, interpersonal, and across multiple places and time spans. So by way of closing, let me offer some imaginings of what is not yet, some speculations about the future of the learning sciences. Technology advances akin to those from the early 80s are clearly upon us. Advances in AI in combination with data analytics are clearly impacting the data we can collect and the supports for teaching and learning that technology can provide. But this brings both opportunities and challenges. Some of the opportunities include making available resources just in time from the vast array of information databases in a more easily accessible way than ever before. We can promote greater metacognitive awareness and reflection. We are beginning to have the techniques to monitor content of social interactions, as well as use of resources. Is becoming possible through advances in natural language processing, along with large language models based on computational techniques to analyze and integrate and make sense of very, very large amounts of data. There will likely be new impetus to computer-supported collaborative learning as speech recognition advances enable monitoring of the content of student interactions, as well as gaze, keystrokes, and so on. AI and data analytics will increase pressure for automated evaluation and assessment of open-ended products of learning. This poses both an opportunity and a challenge. In terms of challenges, we have to ask, just because we can measure some indicator, should we? What does it tell us about learning processes, about what and how people are thinking? AI-assisted classroom pedagogy must come with attention to human practices and mechanisms for learning from human practices. We need to be wary and critically question the impact of such technologies on the relational dimensions of human learning, the social interpersonal dimensions. One challenge will be to harness these techniques to informatively assess processes of learning and the interpersonal interactions that are so fundamental to learning. Beyond the technology opportunities and challenges, an increasingly important focus for the learning sciences concerns social supports for learning. These need to grow in their sophistication as we pursue expanded appreciation for creating, maintaining, and fostering learning environments that are equitable and just, respect to opportunities, processes, and outcomes of learning for diverse learners. Bots like ChatGPT make it all the more important for the learning sciences to continue to create learning environments that foster critical inquiry and that apprentice learners into actually thinking. How do we do this? We need to be able to talk and listen to one another, most importantly. And I mean really listen, because when we listen, we open the doors for collaboration and learning. That doesn't mean simply agreeing with one another. It does mean arguing, challenging, debating, questioning, negotiating ideas and orientations, and doing so with respect for our differences. We need to find venues, face-to-face, virtual, hybrid, in which to engage in this critical activity together. That's really what my whole career reflects: exchange of ideas with a commitment to create, to design from the wisdom forged, working with and collaborating with others in a co-constructive, co-design effort. Thank you.
We have the microphones for questions. Your questions are the only thing standing between you and reception with hors d'oeuvres and drinks, but I know there probably are some questions. If somebody has, I don't know if we have microphones. Oh, here. If someone has a question that has jumped out that wants to pose it, we got one here. Can you hear me? Is this okay? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Excellent. So in one of the slides, it showed that the synergy between the human practice and the technologies to approach. So what I'm trying to think that while we always try to assist the learning environment, improve the learning environment through technology, and from your experience, what do you think that what can help instilling the tendency to a learner to navigate the difficult situations, even when the surrounding is not providing? How that tendency can be instilled? Isn't it a very important component of learning if we see in a holistic way?
You're talking about like the persistence in the face of challenge. That's a really great question. And I'm not sure, I think we're still exploring ways to address that. There is a joy in actually learning and solving problems. It's one of the things we saw when we were doing the original work with the Adventures of Jasper. The kids were jumping up and down out of their seats. It's like, we get to do the research. It's that kind of excitement that you want to create in a classroom context, in informal settings. I mean, kids spend enormous numbers of hours in activities that we really wonder why, because they get some satisfaction out of doing it, right? So I think part of the thing we have to look at is, what are we asking kids to do and why? And is it worth their time to do it? I mean, so much of what we have kids doing is a complete waste of their time. I mean, it's totally unnecessary. It doesn't enhance what they understand. So I think you really have to get at, what are we asking kids to do? Why are we asking them to do it? And do they have any clue as to why? I think, one of the things we discovered in the project that Jim mentioned, this big IES funded Reading for Understanding project, is one of the things that really motivated kids to persist in the face of challenge. Well, there were two things. One were some teachers came up with the notion that they needed to normalize struggle in the classroom. often kids think that it comes easy to everybody but me. And so if I struggle, it means there's something wrong with me because everybody else gets it. Well, externalizing the fact that learning's hard for everybody, that teachers have trouble understanding things, right? Externalizing that and saying, hey, everybody struggles with some aspect of learning. I can't read a map to save myself, as Jim knows. But it's normalizing that struggle and creating purpose to what kids are doing, even if it's stuff that's like skill-based practice, placing that in the context of, hey, you know, you need to be able to do this and get good at this so that you can like do other things and use that as a tool, right? But if we never explain this to kids, it's just another piece of busy work that we're asking them to do. So I think it's being more transparent about why we're having kids or students anywhere do what it applies to college and graduate school as well. Although graduate students, of course, never believe us when we tell them. No, that's not true. It's not always apparent immediately. I have a number of students who've come back to me and said, you know, the best thing you ever told me, although I didn't think so at the time, was, and then they fill in the blank with something, which I have totally forgotten I told them. But in any event, it's the purposefulness, the intentionality of what they're doing that I think is really one of the fundamental keys to persistence.
Thank you. Thank you.
So my question is about the slide that had future direction. And you suggest that we create a space where we engage in productive dialogue and we reach out and make space for opinions that may be different to us. Something I've been struggling with, and I'd love to hear your opinion about it, is in what we call the climate of post-truth, there is a body of research and theoretical consideration that maybe we're better off not opening the Pandora's box about certain topics inside classrooms as to whether there is validity to claims or not. So there is a tension between to what degree do we open up space and dialogue to engage with the other side when it comes to, let's say, claims about climate change or vaccine safety, and how do we reconcile that tension?
That, I don't know if you were here for the first keynote today, but we are living in very trepidatious times for those issues. And it really scares me to the core. And, you know, sometimes I think there are two jobs that I would not want right now. One of them is being a classroom teacher, and the other one is being a police officer. I mean, the tensions that exist, that people are trying to navigate in their just to be able to do their day-to-day job, are just like, I can't even get my head around what they must be experiencing in levels of stress. I don't know the answer to your question. I don't know how to navigate that. I think we need to have dialogue. If we don't have dialogue, then we're just going to get increasingly polarized. And I don't know how we move forward. I really don't know. And it was interesting to hear the keynote this morning about how split, fractionated, not just in the United States, but in many, many countries, things are becoming more and more dichotomized. I don't know how we come back from it. I think it's going to take a lot of effort. You talked about a Pandora's box. I think that, you know, in many ways, the COVID experience opened up a Pandora's box that we can't put the lid back on anymore. And I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you. I know we have to keep talking. I just don't know who's listening. If we can listen to each other as a community, we'll be better off, I'm sure of that.
Okay, we have time for, I think, one more question, and then we'll break for the evening.
And I will be at the social event.
Oh, okay. So, hi, Susan. Yes, some love back here, some students. One historical sort of axiom is those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. Yuval Noah Harari, the historian, has recently been saying that we need to forget the past, that we are repeating it by knowing it. So I'm wondering if in preparing for this talk, if you have any lessons to hand down to us, like what past might we want to forget? Or what new stories do we need to tell ourselves to sort of reimagine the future of the field?
How much time do you have? Oh, boy, that's a tough question. I'm sure there's the past that I've forgotten. I only told you about the past I remember. I know there are things I want to forget, and occasionally I do remember them and say, yeah, I don't want to remember that. I think it's important to be reflective about anything you can remember. And I think it's important to, when you have a question about, gee, I don't really remember what happened back then. I believe in trying to find out. I don't think it's wise to just, there's certain things about the past we want to forget. I think there are always lessons to be learned from history, from the past. And, I've learned a lot in the work that we did. I became more knowledgeable about what historians do and how they think and so on. And it is really, really fascinating to look at the sort of process that historians go through in terms of evaluating and sifting and including or excluding according to rules of evidence that they have in constructing an argument. When I first got into working with David Bloom, who does a lot of more ethnographic work than I'd ever done, I would try to read his papers, and there'd be 20 pages of theoretical assumptions at the very beginning of the article. And it's like, David, why do you spend so much time talking about that? And he said, well, because it's a personal perspective that I'm bringing to the work that I'm doing. And if you don't understand where I'm coming from, then the way I see the data, you need to understand where I'm coming from to understand the way I'm seeing the data. This was like eye-opening to me, where in the journal articles I was reading and writing most of the time, it was like short and sweet introductions because you wanted to get to the question you were asking and how you, et cetera, et cetera. But that was an interesting perspective to me that, from a different, kind of discipline, different orientation to the methodology. I still struggle with being able to get all my theoretical assumptions out, but it's like, I now understand why it's important to do it. So it's not a direct answer to your question, but I think it's never good to cover things up that you think might be uncomfortable.
I think it's been a long day. I think we need to take a break and reconvene over in the library building where we have hors d'oeuvres and our drinks. And if you had questions for Susan, you can come up and get her. She's accessible as always. Here's a small gift from us.
Oh my goodness.
For doing this.